There is a particular silence that descends on a person who has spent too many years performing strength. There is a particular silence that descends on a person who has spent too many years performing strength. It is not the silence of peace. Peace has its own quality, a settling, a softening of the shoulders, a breath that finally goes all the way down into the belly without being intercepted halfway. No, this silence is different. It is the silence that arrives in the kitchen at 4 in the afternoon, where nothing is wrong and nothing is happening, and you find yourself standing motionless with one hand on the counter, looking at the light, moving against the wall, and you do not know how long you have been standing there. The kettle has gone cold, the thought you were thinking has dissolved, and underneath the not thinking, there is something thick and old and entirely unwilling to be named. You have been told, perhaps, that you are an empath, that you feel what others feel before they themselves feel it. That you walk into a room and within a few breaths you know whether the people who live there have been at war, whether the older one is angry with the younger one, whether the man at the end of the table is grieving something he has not yet admitted to himself. All of this is accurate as far as it goes. But what is rarely said, what I want to say to you this afternoon, is that this kind of perception is not free. It is not a gift you carry the way one carries a beautiful stone in the pocket. It is closer to a post, a watch post, and you have been standing at it for a very long time. I will return to this in a moment. But first I want you to notice something. The kind of stillness I described, the 4 in the afternoon stillness, the hand on the counter stillness, that stillness is not laziness, and it is not depression, though it has often been confused with both. It is the moment when the post is briefly unmanned. The sentry has stepped, just for an instant, away from the threshold, and the body, which has been carrying a charge for 40 years, has nowhere to put the charge down. So the body simply stops. The body, you see, has waited a long time to speak, and when at last it begins to speak, it does not speak in words. It speaks in heaviness, in a sudden inability to lift the arm, in a tightness in the jaw that no dentist has been able to explain, in a tiredness that sleep cannot reach. There is a thing I want to tell you which I believe you already know, but which has perhaps never been laid down in front of you in plain language. The body is the last room of the psyche to be entered. Most people, when they begin to look inward, look first at thoughts, then at feelings, then at memories, and they believe they have arrived. They have not arrived. The body is still standing somewhere behind them, holding the truth of the whole matter, waiting to be addressed. And here is what I want to say. Plainly, the body does not speak until the performance ends. Not until then, not before. This is the thesis I want to lay down on the table between us, and I will turn it over and look at it from several sides before the afternoon is done. The body cannot tell you what it knows while you are still busy being strong. The strength itself is the gag. As long as you are performing capability, performing reliability, performing the role of the one who can be counted on, the one who does not collapse, the one who sees clearly and keeps moving, the body must remain silent, because The body knows that if it speaks, the performance will fail. And the performance has been, for many decades, the price of admission to the only life you have known. Let me say that more carefully, because the words went past too quickly. The performance of strength is not vanity. It is not pride. It is, in almost every case I have ever observed, an old contract, older than the person, older than the family in its present form, older sometimes than anyone now living can remember. The contract was signed before there was language to refuse it. The contract reads, in effect, you will be the one who does not break. In exchange, you will be permitted to remain, and the body, which was a child's body when the contract was signed, has been keeping its end ever since. This is why the body finally speaks only in the silences, only in the kitchen at 4 in the afternoon, only when no one is watching and no one needs anything, and the performance briefly becomes pointless. The body waits for the room to be empty, and then it lays its tiredness on the floor like a long grey coat it has been wearing for 50 years. Now, the difficulty, and there is a real difficulty here, I do not want to soften it, is that when the body begins to speak, the first thing most people do is mistranslate. They hear the heaviness and they call it depression. They hear the tightness and they call it stress. They hear the long fatigue and they call it burnout. And then they go searching for techniques: better sleep, better diet, cold water in the morning, a retreat in the mountains, a course on nervous system regulation, and none of these things are wrong. Exactly, the body responds to kindness. And these are forms of kindness, but they are addressed to the symptom and not to the speaker. The body is not asking to be regulated. The body is asking to be heard. There is a difference, and it is the difference between the rest of your life and another 40 years of the post. I once knew a man in his 50s, capable, the kind of man whom others described as steady, who came to me because he had begun, without warning, to weep in the car, not in any orderly way, not at funerals, where weeping would have been expected. He wept at traffic lights. He wept when the radio played a piece of music he did not particularly like. He wept, he told me, looking quite ashamed, when his wife handed him a cup of tea one morning in a manner that was no different from any other morning. And he said to me, with the bewilderment of an intelligent man who has lost the thread of his own story, I do not understand. Nothing is wrong. Why is my body doing this? And I said to him what I will say to you. Your body is not doing anything to you. Your body has stopped doing something for you. It has stopped after 50 some years holding the line, and what is now leaking out at traffic lights is not a new sorrow. It is an old one. It is the sorrow your body agreed to hold for the household when you were 4 years old and your mother could not hold it herself. He sat in the chair for a long time after I said that. He did not weep. He looked at his hands, which were resting on his knees, and he turned them over once, palms up, as if he had not seen them before. And then he said something I have remembered for many years. He said, "So all this time I have been the room my mother needed," and I nodded. Because there was nothing to add. I tell you this story not because your story is his story. It is not. No two are, but because the structure of his recognition is the structure of the recognition. I want to lead you toward the body's speech. When it begins, is not a malfunction. It is a delivery. The body has been carrying a parcel for the household, sometimes for 2 or 3 generations of the household, and at a certain point, the body decides, without consulting you, that it is time to set the parcel down. The trembling, the weeping, the unaccountable exhaustion, the way the chest tightens when a particular person calls, these are not breakdowns. They are deliveries, and what is being delivered is something that was never yours to carry in the first place. I will pause here because I want you to feel the weight of that sentence. Before we go further, the body, when it finally speaks, is not telling you what is wrong with you. The body is telling you what was given to you to hold and what you have held faithfully and what is now ready to be put down. The performance of strength was the agreement to keep holding it. The end of the performance is the moment when the body, at last, lays it down, and in the room where the parcel is set down, there is for a long while only stillness, the 4 in the afternoon stillness, the hand on the counter, the light moving against the wall. This is not the absence of life. This is the first hour of a life that has not been lived yet, because all the previous hours were spent at the post, 5, 2, 9 p.m. Claude Rissendow. I want to speak about what happens next, because the moment the body begins its long-delayed speech is also the moment when nearly every person I have ever. Now I want to speak about what happens next, because the moment the body begins its long-delayed speech is also the moment when nearly every person I have ever observed makes the same wrong turn. They reach for an explanation. They reach for it quickly, the way a hand reaches for the railing on a staircase that has suddenly tilted, and the explanations that are offered to them by the world around them are, almost without exception, mistranslations, not malicious, often well-meaning, but mistranslations nonetheless. And the mistranslation, if it is accepted, will lock the body's parcel back into the body for another 10 or 20 years. So I want us to sit here for a while and look at the wrong turns. Honor be one. Before we go any further, the first mistranslation is the diagnostic one. The body begins to weep at traffic lights, and someone, a kind person, perhaps a clinician, perhaps a friend with some psychological vocabulary, offers a name. The name is usually accurate as far as description goes, and entirely insufficient as far as meaning goes. The name says this is anxiety, this is depression, this is burnout, this is dysregulation, this is a depleted nervous system, and the person who has been weeping at traffic lights receives the name with a certain relief, because the name suggests that the matter has been located and that something can now be done about it. But here is the difficulty, and I want to put it to you plainly. The diagnostic name treats the symptom as if it began in you. The symptom did not begin in you. The symptom is the latest sentence in a conversation that began before you were born, and to call it by a clinical name is to mistake the closing line for the whole play. I do not mean by this that the diagnostic name is useless. It can be useful in the way a label on a jar is useful. It tells you roughly what is inside, but you would not confuse the label with the contents, and you would not believe that by reading the label you had eaten the food. And yet this is what is asked of you when the body's long delivery is reduced to a diagnostic phrase. You are handed the label and told that you now understand what is in the jar. You do not. You have been handed a word for the surface of a thing whose roots go down into soil you have not yet touched. The second mistranslation is the self-improvement one, and it is in some ways more seductive than the first. Here the body speech is heard as a signal that one's habits are insufficient. One has not been sleeping correctly, one has not been eating correctly, one has not been breathing correctly, walking correctly, meditating correctly, exposing oneself to the correct sequences of cold and heat, and so one undertakes a program, one becomes diligent, one arranges the outer house with great care, and the body, which had begun to speak, is once again required to perform this time the performance of recovery, which is in many cases simply the performance of strength wearing a more contemporary costume. Self-care, when it is undertaken in this spirit, is what we call the rearranging of the outer house, but no amount of rearranging the outer house will silence what is happening inside an inner one. The body knows the difference. The body has not been weeping at traffic lights because the breathing technique was wrong. The third mistranslation, and this one I want to handle with particular care, because it is widespread and because it wears the costume of depth, is the spiritual one. Here the body's speech is interpreted as an awakening. The fatigue is reframed as ascension. The trembling is reframed as the opening of subtle channels. The unaccountable sorrow is reframed as the clearing of ancestral patterns, and there is, I will grant, some truth concealed inside this language. The body is indeed delivering something old, something that belongs in part to those who came before, but the spiritual framing in its popular form makes a mistake of direction. It looks upward when the body is asking to be looked downward into. It seeks the heavens when the parcel is buried in the cellar, and it offers often an aesthetic of transcendence in place of the harder work of descent. The body is not asking you to rise. The body is asking you to come down into the room where it has been standing alone for 40 years. So we have these three wrong turns: the diagnostic, the self-improving, the spiritual, and the person who has at last begun to feel the body speak is usually offered one or another of them within a few weeks of the speaking beginning. And here I must say something that may be uncomfortable, but I have come to think it is the truth. What you have been calling pathology was never pathology. It was loyalty, astonishing, exhausting, lifelong loyalty. The body did not malfunction. The body fulfilled, with terrifying precision, an old assignment, and the assignment is the thing that needs to be understood, not the symptom. The symptom is doing its work perfectly. The symptom has been the most reliable member of the household for as long as you can remember. Let me say that again, because I do not want it to slide past. The symptoms are not failing, the symptoms are succeeding. They are succeeding at a task that was given to them long ago by a household that needed someone to carry what the adults in it could not. The fatigue is doing its job, the vigilance is doing its job, the body's refusal to relax has been doing its job for so many decades that to call it dysfunction is to insult the person who has been performing the function. You have not been broken, you have been faithful. There is a great difference, and the entire shape of what happens next depends on which of these two words you accept. I want to bring in here something I tried to set down years ago in a book about the relationship between the conscious self and what lies beneath it. I said then, in language clumsier than I would now choose, that what we do not bring into awareness returns to us as fate. I have not yet found a way to say it more accurately. The phrase has been repeated many times since, often as if it were a kind of warning, as if the unconscious were a creditor who eventually comes to collect. But this is not quite what I meant. What I meant is that the contents of a household, when they are not faced by the adults of the household, do not disappear. They go somewhere. They take up residence in the most porous member of the family, usually the one who, by temperament, cannot keep the door of the inner world closed. And that person carries them, not consciously, not voluntarily. The carrying happens beneath the level at which choosing becomes possible. By the time the child is old enough to speak, the parcel is already in the body. This is why the language of gift, when it is applied to those of unusual perceptiveness, has always seemed to me only half true. It is true that the perceptiveness exists. It is true that it can become, in time, a source of depth and a kind of wisdom that the less porous do not easily attain. But to call it a gift, without saying what it has cost, is to repeat the old contract in cheerful clothing. The contract said, you will hold what we cannot hold, and in exchange you will be permitted to remain in the household. The talk of gift says, you will hold what we cannot hold, and we will admire you for it. This is not liberation. This is the same arrangement, more politely phrased. I am not telling you this to make you bitter. I am telling you this because precision matters, and because the body cannot complete its delivery until the parcel has been correctly identified. As long as you continue to believe that what is happening to you is a malfunction in your individual nervous system, or deficit in your individual habits, or a stage in your individual spiritual development, the body will go on speaking, and you will go on translating its speech into private terms. But the body is not speaking only about you. The body is speaking about a room you were placed in before you could refuse, and about an assignment you accepted before you knew you had a choice. Here's what I want to say to you about that room. The room was real. The people in it were real. The need was real. The child who took up the assignment did so because the alternative was unbearable, not metaphorically unbearable, actually unbearable, the kind of unbearable that a small body cannot survive. The assignment was, in its first form, a survival accomplishment. It was, if you will permit me an old-fashioned word, nobler There is no reason for shame in any direction here. The child who became the holder of the household's unspoken weight was doing what intelligent and feeling children have always done in such circumstances. The error was not in the child. The error, if we must locate one, is in the fact that the assignment was never officially ended. The household ended. The original people aged, or died, or moved away, or simply became unable to occupy the roles they once occupied. But the contract did not dissolve. When the household dissolved, the body went on holding the parcel as if the original room still existed. It is the post at the abandoned gate. The war ended 40 years ago, and no one has come to relieve the sentry. And the sentry, who is by now a person in her 50s or 60s, still stands at attention every morning and does not know why she is so tired. What the body is now doing the weeping at traffic lights, the heaviness at 4 in the afternoon, the hand on the counter that cannot remember what it was reaching for is, very simply, the body's attempt to announce that the war is over, that the gate it has been guarding leads to a courtyard that no longer exists, that the parcel it has been carrying belongs to people who are no longer in the room. The body is not breaking down. The body is, at last, attempting to be discharged, and it is doing so in the only language it has ever been allowed to speak, the language of sensation, of fatigue, of involuntary tears, of a sudden inability to continue performing the role for one more afternoon. If you can hear that, if even a part of you can hear it without immediately reaching for a diagnosis or a program or a spiritual reframe, then something has already begun that cannot be undone. The hearing itself is the first act of the discharge. The sentry, hearing for the first time that the war is over, does not yet leave the post, but she turns her head. She looks, perhaps over her shoulder, toward the inner courtyard she has not entered in many years, and in the turning of the head, the long arrangement begins. At last, to Lawson, 5:31 p.m. Claude responded, I want now to go further down into the structure itself, because the hearing is only the beginning, and the question that follows the hearing is the question T. I want now to go further down into the structure itself, because the hearing is only the beginning, and the question that follows the hearing is the question that almost no one asks aloud if the body has been holding a parcel that was never mine. Then whose parcel is it? And why was it given to me in particular? This is the question I want to walk into with you now, slowly, because the answer is not what most people expect, and the answer is the door through which the rest of your life will pass. Let me begin with what I have observed over many decades in the consulting room, in nearly every household I have ever come to understand from the inside, and I have come to understand a great many. In many languages and many countries, there is one person who has been assigned the inner weather of the family. This is not a role anyone announces. It is not written down. It is not decided upon at a family meeting. It is determined very early by a kind of unconscious triage. The household has more feeling than it can metabolize. The adults, for reasons of their own histories, cannot hold the surplus, and so the surplus is given to the member of the household whose nervous system is most permeable to it. Usually, though not always, this is a child, and usually the child who receives the assignment is the one whose temperament is by nature most open, most willing to enter another's interior without first being invited. The very capacity that will later be called perceptiveness or sensitivity or empathy is what made the child eligible for the assignment in the first place. The capacity preceded the role exploited the capacity, and the two became, over years, indistinguishable. This is the deeper structure I want to name, the thing the world calls sensitivity. In those who have been formed in this way, is not a single phenomenon, it is two phenomena fused together. The first is a real and inborn capacity, a thinness of the membrane between self and other, which some people are born with and some are not, and which has nothing to do with virtue or pathology. The second is an assignment laid upon that capacity by a household that needed it. The capacity could have remained a quality. The assignment turned it into a labor, and what you have been calling your sensitivity all these years is in fact these two things wound around each other so tightly that you have not been able to tell where the inheritance ends and the conscription begins. This is why no amount of work on the symptom of sensitivity ever quite resolves it. The work addresses the capacity as if the capacity were the problem. The capacity is not the problem. The capacity is, in fact, one of the genuine treasures of your particular constitution. The problem is the assignment that was laid on top of it before you were old enough to refuse, and the assignment, unlike the capacity, can be relinquished, but it can be relinquished only after it has been seen clearly enough to be named, and the naming is the hard part, because the assignment has worn the costume of your identity for so long that to remove the costume feels, at first, like removing the self. Let me put this another way, because I do not want it to remain abstract. When a child takes up the role of holder for a household, the child does not experience it as a role. The child experiences it as who I am. There is no separation in the small consciousness between the function and the self. The function is the self, and so when, decades later, the body finally begins to refuse the function, the person to whom it is happening experiences it as a kind of identity crisis. If I am not the one who holds, who am I? If I am not the one who senses what others feel before they feel it, what am I? If I stop performing the strength that has been my admission ticket to every room I have ever entered, will the room still admit me? These are not idle questions. They are the questions the body's discharge forces upon the person who has been living inside the assignment. And here, I want to say something that may sound, at first, counterintuitive. The crisis of identity that arrives when the assignment begins to dissolve is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It is a sign that something is, at last, going right. The dissolution of the assignment cannot occur without the dissolution of the identity that was built on top of it. There is no shortcut here. There is no version of this transition in which the old self remains intact while the old role quietly retires. The role and the self were welded together for 50 years. To separate them is to feel for a period of time that there is no one home, and the temptation at this stage is enormous to reach for a new role to fill the vacancy, to become, instead of the holder of the household, the healer of others, the wise woman, the wounded mentor, the deep one, the awakened one. Any role will do, as long as it fills the silence that the body has at last allowed to enter the house. I want to be careful here. I am not saying these roles are without value. Some of them are, in their proper time, the natural fruit of a long inner life. But when they are taken up too quickly, when they are taken up in order to avoid the silence rather than as a consequence of having lived through it, they are simply the old assignment in new clothing. The body knows, the body, which has been weeping at traffic lights, will weep at the traffic lights of the new role, just as it wept at the traffic lights of the old. The parcel has not been set down. The parcel has been redecorated. So what then must actually happen? This is the question to which the long descent eventually leads, and I want to answer it as plainly as I can. What must happen is that the holder must be permitted, for the first time in her life, not to hold for anyone, not even for herself, not productively, not therapeutically, not as a stage of growth, simply not to hold. The hand that has been gripping for 50 years must be allowed to open, and the muscles of the hand, which have forgotten any other position, must be allowed to ache as they learn what an open hand feels like. This is not a metaphor. The actual muscles of the actual hand will ache. The body, when it begins to put the parcel down, does so muscle by muscle, and each muscle complains as it releases, because each muscle has been clenched for so long that the clenching had become its baseline. The aches are part of the discharge. They are not new injuries. They are old injuries finally being permitted to be felt. I once knew a woman who, during a period when she had at last begun to allow this, came to me and said with great seriousness, "I think there is something wrong with my shoulders. They hurt in a way they have never hurt before." And I asked her, "When did you last lower them?" And she looked at me, and her face did a thing I have seen on the faces of many people in my consulting room over the years, a kind of slow widening, as if a door behind the face had been pushed open from the other side. She did not answer the question that day. She came back the following week and said, "I do not know. I do not remember ever lowering them." Her shoulders had been raised toward her ears since she was perhaps 6 years old. The pain of lowering them was not pathology. The pain of lowering them was the body remembering what it had been doing for 54 years. This is the kind of discharge I am pointing toward. It is not glamorous. It does not produce immediately a feeling of liberation. It produces, in the first phase, fatigue and ache and a great deal of weeping that does not seem to have a subject. The weeping does not have a subject because the weeping is not about a single event. The weeping is the body's record of every event in which it was asked to hold what it could not hold. And the events have been queued in the body for so long that they now emerge as a kind of undifferentiated grief. To require the grief to identify itself before it is allowed to be felt is to refuse, once again, what the body has been trying to deliver. The grief does not need to identify itself. The grief needs to be allowed. And here is the second thing I want to say. The harder thing, the thing that the language of self-help has not yet found a way to say without flattening it. The grief that is now arriving is not only your own, a portion of it, a substantial portion. In many cases, belongs to those who came before you. Your mother's unwept weeping, your father's unspoken fear, your grandmother's silent endurance during a war she never described to anyone in detail. These were not metaphysical inheritances. These were sensations that had nowhere to go, and they went into the most porous body in the line, and the most porous body in the line was yours. And when the body now weeps at traffic lights, it is not only weeping for itself, it is completing on behalf of the line a weeping that was begun 70 or 100 years ago and never finished, because the people who began it could not afford, in the conditions they were living in, to finish it. This is the harder truth, and it is the place where the contrarian precision of this matter becomes sharpest. If the weeping is loyalty, then you cannot fight it. You can only thank it, and the thanking is much harder than the fighting, because to thank the weeping is to acknowledge that it has been doing a kind of work that no one else in your family of origin was able to do. It has been completing the unfinished. It has been carrying into the room of the present a parcel that was packed in a room you never saw. And to set the parcel down is not merely a personal act. It is, in a sense I cannot fully articulate, an act on behalf of those who could not set it down themselves. The line, through you, is at last permitted to lay down a portion of what it has been carrying. I want to put it this way. There is a long work I wrote, late in my life, on the union of opposites, on the strange and difficult marriage that must occur within a single human being between what has been lived consciously and what has been lived only beneath consciousness. I was attempting in that book to describe a process that takes many years and that is rarely complete in any one lifetime. But the simplest form of the process is this: a thing that has been held without being known must, at some point, to be both held and known at once. The holding without knowing is the condition of the loyal child. The knowing without holding is the condition of the merely intellectual adult who has read about her own history but has not felt it. The holding and knowing together, this is the condition in which the parcel can, at last, be set down, not because it has been forgotten, because it has been, for the first time, fully received. This is what your body has been preparing for. All these years, not collapse, not breakdown, reception. The body has been holding the parcel until consciousness was strong enough to come and stand beside it and say, I see what you have been carrying. I see whose it is. I see why it was given to you. I am here now. And in that meeting between the consciousness that has at last arrived and the body that has been waiting, the parcel is, very slowly, set down, not by force of will, by the simple fact of having been at last witnessed. The sentry does not abandon her post because she is ordered to. The sentry leaves her post when she is, at long last, relieved. And the one who relieves her is no one outside. The one who relieves her is the part of you that has finally turned after all these decades and walked toward the gate and looked her in the face and said, I see you. You have stood here long enough. The war is over. Come inside. 5:32 p.m. Claude responded, what I want to speak about now is what comes after the sentry has been relieved. Because there is a long stretch of time after the relief that almost no one is. What I want to speak about now is what comes after the sentry has been relieved. Because there is a long stretch of time after the relief that almost no one is prepared for, and the unpreparedness has caused many people to mistake the most important phase of their lives for a failure. I want to describe that phase carefully, because if you can recognize it when it arrives, you will not turn away from it. And if you do not turn away from it, the rest of what is possible for you will become possible. The phase I am describing has, in my own private vocabulary, no good name. I have sometimes called it the empty room. I have sometimes called it the long afternoon. Other times, I have simply called it the silence after the contract. Whatever we call it, the texture of it is this. The body has begun, at last, to set down the parcel. The weeping at traffic lights has either passed or become familiar enough that it no longer alarms. The shoulders have begun, in some hours of the day, to lower toward their natural position. The vigilance that has been running for 50 years has, in moments, paused, and what is left in those pauses is not joy, it is not relief, it is something stranger. It is a kind of vast and slightly disorienting quiet in which one becomes aware that one does not, in fact, know what to do with oneself. The role has loosened, the performance has ended, and the person who was, for so long, the holder of the household's weight is now standing in a room without a job description. This is the moment, more than any other, when people reach for the new role. I described this in the previous part of our conversation, but I want to return to it now from a different angle, because the temptation is so strong and the consequences of yielding to it so subtle. The empty room frightens people. It frightens them. I have come to think more than the original suffering did. The original suffering at least had a shape. It had an enemy. It had a story. The empty room has none of these. It is simply the absence of the assignment, and in that absence, the self has nothing immediate against which to define itself, and so the temptation, as I said, is to fill the room, to become a healer, a teacher, a wise one, a person who has been through and now returns to bring others through. These are not, in themselves, wrong roles. They are, in some lives, the right roles, but they are wrong if they are taken up to escape the empty room. If they are taken up to escape the empty room, they will be structurally the old contract in new closing, and the body, which is wiser than the ego, will eventually announce this fact with another round of weeping at traffic lights. Perhaps in 5 years, perhaps in 10, the empty room must be allowed to remain empty for a while. This is, I think, the single most important thing I can say to you this afternoon. The empty room is not a problem to be solved. The empty room is the first room of the life that is actually yours, and it will furnish itself in time from sources that have never had the chance to speak before, but they cannot speak if the room is immediately filled with the noise of a new role. They need the silence in order to find their way to the surface. They have been waiting, some of them, for 50 years. They will not push to be heard. They will wait patiently in the dark until the room is quiet enough that their small voices can come into it without competition. What are these voices? Here I must speak with some care, because the language of inner voices has been worn thin by careless use. I do not mean anything mystical, or at least not in the way that word is usually understood. I mean, very simply, the parts of you that were never given air, the part that wanted, when you were 9 years old, to spend an entire afternoon doing absolutely nothing. The part that was curious about something useless, the part that found a particular shape of cloud beautiful and would have looked at it for an hour if no one had been waiting for you to perform a function. The part that had preferences that were never consulted because the household had no room for the preferences of the holder. These parts did not die. They went underground. They have been waiting beneath the floorboards of the empty room for the holder to stop performing long enough that they might come up and be met. And when they come up, they do not announce themselves dramatically. They come up as small, almost embarrassing impulses. A desire to plant something, a desire to learn an instrument too late in life to ever be good at it, a desire to walk for an hour in a direction that leads nowhere in particular, a desire to read a book about a subject that has no use. These desires are the first inhabitants of the room that is actually yours. They are not impressive. They are not therapeutic. They will not make anyone admire you. They are simply the first true preferences of a self that has at last been given permission to have preferences. I want to say something here about the relationship between this phase and what is called, in our usual vocabulary, the second half of life. There is a turning in many lives, somewhere after the middle, in which what mattered before begins to matter less, and what is now beginning to matter has not yet announced its name. The turning is often experienced as a loss. It is, in fact, a transfer of authority from the constructed self to a deeper self that has been waiting for the constructed self to exhaust itself. The constructed self, in those who have spent their first decades as the holder of a household, is very thoroughly constructed indeed. It does not exhaust itself easily. It will continue to perform strength long past the point at which strength is required. And so, in such people, the turning often arrives not as a quiet shift in emphasis, but as a kind of crisis, the body refusing to continue, the role collapsing, the assignment dissolving. What looks like a breakdown is, in fact, the long-delayed turning which has had to take a more violent form because the constructed self would not yield to anything gentler. It tried In a book I wrote toward the end of my life, in which I attempted to set down what I could remember of my own life, to describe how the second half asks of us something quite different from what the first half asked. The first half asks us to build an outer life that can carry us. The second half asks us to descend into the inner life that has been waiting beneath the outer one. These are not in opposition. The second is impossible without the first, but the first, if it is held too long, becomes a prison. And those who were assigned the role of holder very early are particularly at risk of holding the first half task long after its season has passed, because the holding is the only mode they have ever known. The body's refusal, when it comes, is the second half forcing its way through the wall of the first. There is something I once wrote that I want to bring in here, because it bears on the present matter more directly than is usually noticed. I said, in language I have since wished I had softened, that until one makes the unconscious conscious, it will direct one's life and one will call it fate. The phrase has been repeated in many contexts, often as a kind of inspirational maxim, which was not at all what I intended. What I intended was something more sober. I meant that the contents of the household, the unwept weeping, the unspoken fear, the assignments laid on the poorest child, do not stay where they are placed unless they are seen. If they are not seen, they continue to operate from beneath. They will choose your partner. They will choose your work. They will choose, in many small ways and several large ones, the shape of the life you will call yours. And the calling it yours will not be entirely accurate, because a great deal of what you will be calling yours will in fact be the unconscious arrangement of the household, still operating through your body, decades after the household has dispersed. This is what is meant by fate. Fate is the unconscious held in the body and not yet brought to consciousness. It is not a metaphysical force, it is a very specific psychological condition, and the consequence of bringing it to consciousness is not the abolition of fate, but its conversion into something else, into life that can, for the first time, be lived rather than enacted, when the body has at last completed its long delivery, and the empty room has been allowed to remain empty long enough that its true inhabitants have begun to surface, and the constructed self has loosened its grip enough that something deeper can come forward. What emerges is not a new role, but a new relationship to roles. The person who has been through this transition can still take up tasks, can still care for others, can still be perceptive, still be the one who sees what others do not, but the seeing is no longer a labor, it is no longer the price of admission, it has returned to being what it originally was. Before the assignment was laid upon it, a capacity, a quality, a way of being in the world, and the difference between capacity and assignment, which I named earlier in our conversation, becomes, at last, lived rather than merely understood. The capacity is yours. The assignment was not. You may now use the capacity in whatever way the inner life of your second half asks you to use it, or not use it, or use it sometimes and not other times, without the using of it being the condition of your continued existence in the household of the world. This is, I think, the meaning of what I have called individuation, though I want to say plainly that individuation is not a destination, it is not a state one achieves and then inhabits, it is a relationship, a continuing relationship between the conscious self that walks through the day and the deeper self that has its own knowledge and its own timing and its own slow purposes. The relationship begins to be possible only when the conscious self has stopped performing on behalf of an old household that no longer exists. Before that, the conscious self has no attention to spare for the deeper one. The whole of the conscious self has been occupied at the post. After the relieving of the post, the attention is at last available, and the deeper self, which has been waiting patiently for the attention to become available, begins in small and quiet ways to enter into conversation. The conversation is not loud. It is not the kind of conversation one can perform for others or describe convincingly at a dinner table. It happens at 4 in the afternoon, in the kitchen, with the light moving against the wall. It happens in the half hour before sleep, when the body has finally agreed with the bed and a thought arrives that does not belong to the day's business. It happens on walks that lead nowhere. It happens sometimes in a single sentence read in a book that has been sitting on the shelf for 20 years and has finally been opened. The deeper self speaks softly because it has no need to be heard by anyone but you. It is not performing. It has never performed. It has waited all these decades for the performance to end so that the conversation could begin. And so I want to end this afternoon with what I take to be the truth of the matter. Plainly stated, the strength you performed for so long was real. It accomplished what it needed to accomplish. It carried you and a portion of the household through conditions that could not have been survived otherwise. It is not to be despised, it is to be thanked and then released. The body's refusal to continue performing it is not a betrayal of who you are. It is the announcement that who you are has at last become larger than the role that was assigned to you. You have outgrown the assignment. The body knew before the mind knew. The body has been signaling by every means available to it that the time for the assignment has ended and the time for the life beneath the assignment has begun. The sentry, when at last relieved of her post, does not vanish. She turns slowly and she walks inside and she sits down by a fire that has been burning all these decades in a room she always believed was empty. The room was never empty. It was only that she had never been permitted to enter it. The fire was lit long ago by the part of you that no household could ever fully recruit, and it has been waiting for you patiently in the inner room with a chair already drawn up beside it. For as long as you have been alive,
this has been Carl Jung Original, a space where the patterns most people live through can finally be named. Voice and imagery, AI-assisted interpretation and framing, original work. Until next lecture.